Good afternoon and welcome to TBARTA's Innovative Transit Technology webinar. I am Chris Jedick, Director of Communications for TBARTA. I'd like to welcome you all here. I want to turn it over to Brian Passero, who's our Principal Planner and heads up the research for Innovative Transit Technology for TBARTA. Brian?
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Advanced Air Mobility, Integrating the Third Dimension into Metropolitan Planning Systems. My name is Brian Passaro. I'm a Principal Planner with TBARTA, the Tampa Bay Area Regional Transit Authority. In July, TBARTA completed the Innovative Transit Technology study, which looked at 3 innovative modes of transit, one of which is air taxis. Air taxis are a completely new topic for me. I've been a transportation planner for over 20 years, and all that time I have only dealt with surface transportation. I'm sure that many of you in our audience are in the same position. The purpose of today's webinar is to help educate planners and other transportation professionals on the topic of urban air mobility. The speakers you're going to hear today are from the Community Air Mobility Initiative, a nonprofit group dedicated to educating the public and government agencies about urban air mobility. Anna Dietrich and Yolanda Wolf are co-executive directors. A little bit of background on the two of them. In 2006, Ms. Dietrich co-founded Terrafugia, a company that invented a flying car with the goal of making personal aviation more accessible. Since stepping down from the founding chief operating officer role in 2014, she has become an industry recognized leader in the urban air mobility, electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, and innovative personal aviation industries. She's an expert in policy, certification, and government relations in the aviation industry, as well as startup company operations. Ms. Wolf is a business attorney and consultant with over 2 decades of experience in the successful development, implementation, and management of mission-driven programs. Prior to joining CAMI, she was a sustainable aviation consultant for 10 years. She's a member of several aviation-related committees, including the Transportation Research Board, New Users of Shared Airspace Committee, and the National Business Aviation Association Emerging Technologies Committee. She also serves as the executive director of the Comparative Aircraft Flight Efficiency, or CAFE Foundation, where she organizes the annual Electric Aircraft Symposium. And with that, I will hand it over to Anna.
Thank you very much. I believe we do have some slides to be shared. Are those coming up? Yolanda, am I sharing those?
Or are you
sharing those?
Stand by 1 second and they're coming your way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction, Brian, and thank you for the opportunity, both Chris and Brian, to talk with you and with the attendees today. I know, especially as we're sandwiched between Thanksgiving and the winter holidays, that everyone's very busy, so I very much appreciate the time. So you go ahead and advance to the next one, please, Yolanda. So the Community Air Mobility Initiative was founded by Yolanda and myself in 2019 to support state and local decision makers and communities with urban air mobility and electric vertical takeoff and landing, or eVTOL aircraft. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so we don't advocate for any particular commercial interest, but rather serve as a bridge between the various stakeholders within the industry, so manufacturers, operators, regulators, really the entire spectrum of players in the space. Our goal with sessions like this is to educate and to empower folks like yourselves that have to make decisions about what to do with these upcoming technologies, so that they can be integrated into our communities in a way that sets us up for the greatest long-term possible success. So next slide, please. And these technologies are, these are very new technologies that are being developed, that are being implemented in the aviation industry. We like to think of this as sort of the third revolution in transportation. I think can we be on slide 4, please? I'm sorry. And so we like to think of this as sort of the third revolution in aviation. So we had powered flight, which was sort of the basic, like, let's get airplanes off the ground, Wright brothers. And then we had the jet age, which redefined how we all interact with aviation. And then now what we're seeing today is these various technologies coming together to really redefine the potential for personal aviation and having a flight be much more of a part of our daily transportation needs. And up to this point, it has been fairly a technology push activity, and we'll talk about that theme a little bit as we go. But if we want to go to the next slide, one of the major new technologies that's driving this new third revolution, as we said, is electric propulsion. So conventional aircraft propulsion, as we all know, it's loud, it's not particularly environmentally friendly, and there's challenges associated with operating aircraft with conventional propulsion in locations that are more closely coupled to our daily lives. So we tend to segregate into airports. Electric propulsion solves a lot of those issues and improves on a lot of those challenges that we see with conventional aircraft propulsion. So it really does increase the potential accessibility of aviation for our daily transportation needs. And there's a significant amount of progress that has already happened in this space. There's a number of certification efforts that are in various levels of maturity. There's a number of full-size aircraft being developed. And the images that you see here are conventional aircraft that are being retrofit with electric propulsion, and there's significant value there. But also, as you see in the next slide on slide 6, that there is a whole new type of aircraft configuration that is enabled by electric propulsion. So we can do things with electric motors from an aircraft design perspective that really aren't tractable with conventional fossil fuel propulsion. And that has enabled this whole proliferation of electric vertical takeoff and landing, or eVTOL aircraft. And this is, while this is a bit Jetson-y and a bit newfangled, there are a lot of aircraft that are currently in full-size flight testing. By my estimations, there's over 1,000 of these full-size aircraft that are aircraft flight tests that happen, that have already happened this year, possibly an order of magnitude more than that. So this is something that is very much happening. It's very much being developed on the technology front, and really something that we need to be sort of thinking about how to integrate this and what to do with it. The next technology that's really coming along that is part of the enabling landscape for this is on slide 7, on the next slide, which is autonomy. So there's been various extensive autonomy present in aviation for quite some time. We have had autopilots, we have had navigation aids, we have had pieces of flight automated or autonomous for quite some time, actually. There's a significant portion of every commercial airliner flight that is fully hands-off for the pilot on the flight deck. This is a good thing in terms of increasing safety, and the industry is poised to sort of take it to the next level. So as we look at the existing general aviation flights, which are typically considered flights where you have an individual pilot flying for their own purposes, though GA is broader than that. There's about 75% of those accidents in that space are due really directly to human error. And you can train people, and we do train people, and we can certificate pilots, and we do that, but humans are still valuable in a way that a certified and validated software system may not be going forward. So there's an opportunity here to provide an additional layer of safety, as well as to enable different aircraft configurations that may not be as easy to fly as what is common to date, and incorporating the autonomous systems into those aircraft design make those new and novel eVTOL aircraft much easier to operate. Even if there is a human involved in operating them, it can really support that process. So it's important to remember, though, that sort of the last point here is that not all eVTOL aircraft are autonomous, and not all autonomous aircraft are eVTOLs, similarly to not all electric aircraft are eVTOLs. So there's sort of distinct streams of technology that are being developed, but the convergence of them is particularly interesting. And it enables these opportunities. It also has challenges associated with figuring out the appropriate certification requirements and how to earn the public's trust for these new systems. If you want to go to the next slide, please. One thing that both electric propulsion and autonomy have already enabled is UAS, or unmanned aircraft systems, which is distinct from urban air mobility, as we'll describe it in a moment here. So UAS is generally conceived of as smaller aircraft not capable of carrying passengers, but potentially carrying cargo. Really working at a lower altitude and sort of smaller scale than traditional aviation. What this slide is attempting to capture is that you have a convergence of traditional aircraft and UAS, sort of the small drones, with general aviation and airline operations, and that the eVTOL aircraft that are being developed for use in the urban air mobility environment are closer to general aviation and airline aircraft than they are to hobbyist model aircraft and drones, but they do take aspects of all of those pieces together in their development and design and operation. In terms of how all of these aircraft are going to play with each other in the airspace, that is a question that the industry is currently reckoning with and figuring out. There are questions of who is responsible for what, of where the preemption lines for FAA and state and local jurisdictions are drawn. And there's questions of infrastructure access and interoperability and all of those pieces, which are actively being discussed and worked today. So it's a complicated airspace landscape with a number of both conventional and new entrants into that airspace. One of the things that I'll mention just briefly here also is that we do have, thanks to the existing general aviation industry and infrastructure that supports that, we do already have the capability to start incorporating some of these new aircraft, both drones and urban air mobility eVTOL aircraft, into the existing system at a low level. And that concept of crawl, walk, run is one that gets a lot of airtime within the space. So if we want to go to the next slide and look at just what exactly are we talking about here. So advanced air mobility is a phrase that NASA has coined and is making popular recently. It is sort of the umbrella under which you could say UAM, or urban air mobility, lies. Under that same umbrella is also regional air mobility. Those are just really differentiated based on the range of operation of the flights. So you can see that there's sort of 5 zones of operation that advanced air mobility sort of covers, some of which would be considered traditional UAM, and some would be more this regional air mobility concept. So city center operations, that's urban air mobility. Suburbs to city is often on the edge of UAM. Edge city to either a main metropolitan area or another edge city starts to get into the regional air mobility space. Rural access is another very promising application for regional air mobility. And then hub airport access, so getting into the main commercial hub airports, depending on how far you're going, could be either considered UAM or regional air mobility. The types of operation that we see happening in this space are fairly varied, not just air taxi. So there's the traditional airline model of scheduled flights. This would be considered sort of micro-haul airline because these aircraft are smaller. They tend to hold between 2 and 6 passengers. Air Metro would be like a bus schedule where you're running one of these aircraft on a fixed route, get on and off at various verteports as you see fit. The on-demand air taxi is one of the use cases that got sort of the most attention earliest on in this space. May or may not be one of the earlier implementations of UAM and RAM, however. Airport shuttle, it's the hub airport access corollary there. And that has the potential to bring benefits in terms of airside access versus groundside access, and how do you navigate security, and maybe you can screen before you get on your eVTOL aircraft and that kind of thing. So there's opportunities to be creative there. And then emergency services is one that we are particularly interested in just because of the large potential public benefit that brings. So when we say UAM or AAM, this is the space that we're discussing discussing. UAS is certainly something that will be operating in many of these same arenas, but given that it's not passenger carrying aircraft, it tends to not be the focus of our conversations as CAMI or the same regulatory conversations that the UAM and eVTOL aircraft cover. So next slide, please. So just some statistics to give you a sense of the scale of this industry that we're talking about here. So these are some pretty big numbers. There's T's and B's on these dollar amounts. So this is something that is getting a lot of investment interest today and has the potential to be a significant economic driver in the future. You know, this is encouraging for players in the space that are developing aircraft. But I think a small dose of realism is probably appropriate as well, as despite the large size of this potential market, there's a lot that has to go into getting there. So the investment dollars that are needed today to realize these markets are also non-trivial. So there is a lot of uncertainty still in which players are going to navigate that research and development phase and become commercial successful players in this space. But the significance of this space is large. Next slide, please. There are a number of players that are seriously pursuing accessing that market, addressing that market, and that number has dramatically increased in recent days. So as little as 3 years ago or so, there were only about a dozen companies that were publicly working in this space. Today, there's over 300 published concepts for eVTOL aircraft. Now, of course, many of those will not come to fruition, but I think it speaks to the level of interest and the confidence that this is a real market. And of those 300 or so, there's about a dozen of them in active discussion with FAA on aircraft certification. And as I mentioned earlier, we're talking, thousands of test flights at this point in time. Companies keep those specifics fairly close to the vest, but just looking at the number of full-size prototypes that have been publicly photographed and shared, and some of our industry knowledge is definitely a real thing and definitely a repeatable thing from a technology development perspective. Next slide, please. And it's not just the aviation industry, traditional aviation industry, that is interested in this. And I think this speaks to sort of the broad credibility of the space and the potential market that we're looking at. Lots of automotive manufacturers have invested or are investing heavily in eVTOL aircraft. Next slide, please. So focusing back on sort of the different components that are necessary for this industry to realize all of that great promise, we want to look at how we currently treat transportation and aviation today. So today, aviation is very segregated from the rest of our transportation infrastructure. There's usually a fence with barbed wire somewhere around the airport, and you have to go through a security screening process, and use a very separate world from how we traditionally get around on a daily basis, or how we did used to get around on a daily basis back when commuting was a thing everyone did. So for advanced air mobility and urban air mobility to be successful, metaphorically speaking, at least, those fences have to come down. We have to integrate aviation into our existing transportation landscapes, and that will both give us an opportunity to address existing challenges, but also create new ones. So we want to make sure that we're not just modifying where the traffic congestion is. We want to be paying attention to issues like urban sprawl, environmental impact, those sorts of questions and consideration. And we'll see shortly that mitigating those are a key part of public acceptance for this as well. On the next slide, you can see that the regulatory landscape and the players that are involved in this span the entire spectrum of government that we have in the states here. So everything from local city ordinance all the way through state law and federal regulation are applicable to this space. And CAMI's focus is on the state and local landscape. There are other organizations that are working directly with the FAA on the part of the industry. But like I said, we really felt that state and local piece was essential for getting this right. So all of you are critical links in the chain for making the future as bright as we think it can be for this. On the next slide, This is what we often call the cast of characters, so you may recognize your role in one of these boxes. And all of these different voices need to be part of the conversation as we think about what is urban air mobility and how do we actually implement it for our communities and our society going forward. The public is a very key voice in all of this, not one that is potentially as connected to the conversation today as we'll need to be, but that's something that we are hoping to collaborate with the state and local representatives and decision makers and outreach to that group as well. So public acceptance on the next slide, kind of how we're thinking about what that looks like and what does it take to get public acceptance and what are the different pieces there. Sort of a balance between these four different key aspects. So trust is essential, safety is non-negotiable. Public benefit is something that I think needs to be front of mind, is what is the broad value that's coming from these operations. It's not just, oh, is this cool technology, but actually what do we stand to benefit? In what ways do we stand to benefit from this as a community? How is it integrated into our existing transportation options? That's a key supporter of the benefits that could be realized. And then again, in the interest of trust and transparency, not trying to deny that there's the potential for adverse impacts, but rather being transparent about them and working to mitigate them as much as possible. So making sure that we're being mindful of how infrastructure is placed and what the potential impacts in terms of noise and environment could be. So all of these pieces have to be considered in any sort of plan to implement urban air mobility in order to increase the odds of public acceptance of this new industry and technology. On the next slide, we've expanded on some of the public benefit concepts because, again, this is really central to making sure that folks think it's worth it to do this. And you can see there's a broad variety of possible benefits here, and I'm sure this is not a complete list. Workforce development, economic opportunities come both in the form of direct economic and job creation based on putting in verteports in locations, but they also come in the connectivity and things like that, increased range of access to the urban core, and really bringing a broader range of opportunities within reach. On the next slide, you can see that concept of bringing sort of that broad range of opportunities within reach. Humans throughout time have typically spent about the same amount of time traveling. It's about an hour, and there's different estimates for what that is, some more, some less, but for our purposes, we'll say it's about an hour. And when you could just walk, that didn't get you very far, right? And then when you had a horse and buggy, you could get farther. Early automobiles increased that range of influence within an hour to about 45 miles. The modern car, about 70 miles. With some of the wing-borne eVTOL aircraft that are in development today, that range for your personal reach within that hour of travel time could go up to 150 miles or more. So that significantly changes sort of our conception of suburbs, our conception of where I can go to work versus where I live, what economic and educational and medical opportunities are available to me. So really a dramatic shift in sort of our mental model of what is accessible to me on a regular daily basis. And I believe that that is one of the most transformative pieces of the urban air mobility industry that we will see is the impact of that increase in range for that given travel time. On the next slide, there's we mentioned that there's adverse impacts. These are some of them. One thing that I will highlight here is just that electric aircraft, just like electric automobiles, are only as green as the grid. So where you're getting the electricity with which to power these vehicles is critical to whether or not they are a net environmental benefit or not. So that's definitely something to be mindful of as we think about increasing the electric generation capacity and grid capacity. Is where is that energy coming from? In the interest of making sure I leave enough time for Yolanka, I'll just go ahead and go on to the next slide. One of the main adverse impacts that people think about is noise, and that's obviously important. We want these aircraft to be as quiet as possible, but without the offsetting public benefit, they can't be quiet enough. So even silence can be too loud if people don't understand a benefit that they personally or their communities are receiving for that aircraft. So as we know from our response to first responder vehicles, people don't tend to complain about noise from those vehicles or aircraft because they know the direct benefit is there. So we just want to make sure, again, that the perceived value for the community, whether it come in the form of first responders or increased travel options or other things, is there to offset even a very minimal amount of public inconvenience, as it were, with the impact of these aircraft. On the next slide, again, it's kind of just touching on our approach to noise. It's tempting to set a hard line, to draw a line in the sand and say that if you're below a certain level, you're okay, and if you're above a certain level, you're not okay. And we feel that that is an oversimplification and doesn't appropriately take into account this public benefit conversation. So we don't want to be saying that there's an absolute right answer to the noise question. We want to be empowering local jurisdictions to be able to answer that question appropriately for their communities, their existing ambient soundscape, and the benefit that they will be receiving from bringing these aircraft into their transportation landscape, instead of just saying, oh, here's the right answer. So we think that's a very customizable challenge and a customizable right answer there. So right sizing as opposed to arbitrarily restricting is our recommendation for how to approach noise, even though it is a bit more complicated to think about. And the last slide that I'll share with you before I hand things over to Yolanka is just, again, highlighting one of the pieces from that public acceptance chart. The integration is really key. So we need to make sure that as we bring verteports and eVTOL aircraft into the urban landscape, into even the suburban and rural landscapes, that they are appropriately integrated with everything that already exists, and that we're using our various transportation modes in concert with each other to facilitate as seamless multimodal travel as possible. And instead of just sort of trying to shoehorn something in on top of what already exists or replace what already exists, to focus on how do we combine and be additive. So with that, I will hand things over to Yolanka and let her take it from here. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Anna. And the morning sun in Seattle here is just catching me through my window, so bear with me with a little bit of squinting until it moves past the next rooftop. I will move on to the slides that I have to share with you. So Anna has done a wonderful job of explaining where the industry and the technology for these vehicles rests at this point. It's moving forward quickly, as she mentioned. And we are now at the point where we recognize that the vehicles, while they're flying, while they're on their way to certification, need a place to fly if there is any purpose at all in developing them and commercializing them. So I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about advanced air mobility from a planning and infrastructure perspective, to share a little bit more about that aspect of this entire form of new transportation. So when we talk about the infrastructure considerations, what I have here, this is increasingly rising to the top as the next major step. So we need to consider including both new and repurposed existing infrastructure, and we need to consider the different types of vehicles and what their needs are. And as Anna just mentioned, we really need to consider how this all integrates into ground transportation systems. So here we've laid out some of the questions that as planners we need to be asking so that we can make these decisions in a holistic way for our communities. So what is the built environment we're trying to serve? What does the landscape look like? There are very different requirements and benefits that come from using small airports in rural areas versus trying to put a vertiport in the middle of an urban area. Are we going, what do we have already existing? Are we building new infrastructure, or are we repurposing existing infrastructure? And what type of land uses and infrastructure do we need to look at? Do we need to repurpose, renovate, or redevelop to support urban air mobility, advanced air mobility? Very important, what are the first and last mile connections? As Anna mentioned, aviation is used to existing in this kind of separate silo of transportation. And when we bring advanced air mobility into the picture and we tear down that metaphorical fence, we are intimately integrating air transportation with ground transportation into a seamless multimodal system. How do we prioritize public transportation, pooled vehicles, active transportation? How do we connect those different forms of transportation to, again, make this a seamless system? How do we integrate verteports into nearby land uses? As we'll look at this a little bit more, but as you start to think about a vertiport, as you probably know, Florida, outside of Orlando, just announced the development of a vertiport at Lake Nona in a major development. What does that look like? What does a vertiport look like inside a residential development versus an urban area versus more of a commercial or industrial location? And what are those adverse impacts, and how do we mitigate them? So those are some of the questions we need to ask. When we think about the role of the built environment, context matters. And this slide shows some of those different areas from city center, suburban, edge city to rural. One size does not fit all. There are different needs, there are different purposes, there are different geographies, and this is very much a construction that needs to be customized for the location, both from the landscape and the purpose perspective. So we need to develop strategies that are tailored to meet a diverse array of needs, from small communities to auto-oriented megaregions and transit-oriented megaregions. So while much of the publicity in the industry has been focused on these urban core vertiports, they're most likely the furthest out in terms of implementation on any type of scale. However, we do have the opportunity to use existing infrastructure to jumpstart this new form of transportation by revitalizing existing public airports. These airports, there are 5,000 in the country, and they're largely underused or unused. Across the US, we only use about 10% of our public airports. However, they have the ability to provide an important resource to their communities by entering the electric aviation industry. So Florida has 128 public airports. Of those, 20 currently have scheduled service. These small airports can connect communities in a clean, cost-effective manner. So not only can they accommodate both the electric fixed wing and the eVTOL aircraft, they can become important contributors and members of their communities. They can serve as collectors and storers of electricity to provide charging for aircraft, but also ground vehicles, and provide extra grid capacity for their community. They can provide maintenance and repair operations for electric aircraft. They also can be air and ground transportation hubs for both passengers and goods. So with low-cost electric aircraft, it's possible to reconnect smaller communities that became isolated due to the decline of the regional air carriers. When we think about these airports, what do we need to do to get existing airports ready for electric aviation? Well, of course, we need to start by considering if electric aircraft deployment should be incorporated into those long-term transportation and airport planning efforts. We need to educate airport users and the tenants and community stakeholders about electric aviation benefits and impacts. That's core to CAMI's role. We need to develop electric aircraft and electric generation and storage infrastructure in coordination with utility companies. So utility companies were one of those characters in that cast of characters, very important role. But again, looking at airports, when we start to think about airports as more than just a place that aircraft come and go, but as a community hub for transportation, for electricity, for goods distribution, we can see that there's so much more opportunity with small airports. We need to work with local planners so that we incorporate this third dimension into comprehensive and transportation planning efforts. We need to work with local universities to promote these technologies, and we need to support workforce development. There are opportunities for flight schools and for connections with local industry. So now turning from existing airports, let's look at a little bit closer to verteports and some of the different types. So small airfields, existing airfields, this is really that intersection with existing small airports. That's one place where we can see verteports located. We can also look at purpose-built facilities that serve a region that are close to a destination city, close to an urban area, that are designed especially for electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles. We also have concepts of commercial city verteports. So these are verteports within large cities. They can be combined into transportation hubs with existing infrastructure, and they're designed to handle large volumes of traffic. And then finally, support verteports. So these are for maintenance, for recharging. These could be co-located or located at a small airport. They could also be co-located with in industrial areas with cargo warehouses. So again, think of this as the bus barn for electric aircraft. But whether we're looking at rejuvenating existing airports or planning for new verteports, it's important to look at the facilities as multimodal transportation hubs that offer a multitude of services. So we need to, in this slide, you see this schematic of the core of the mobility hub that includes the public transit, the vertiport. Then you have a zone on the outside that has more kind of free-floating mobility options, and then the catchment area around the outside for transit and TNCs. So thinking about those transportation modes and how they all intersect with a mobility hub, thinking about last mile delivery and connections. We need to think about the services, that whether it's charging or battery swapping, whether it's places to park the aircraft. Some vertiports may not have, or mobility hubs may not be designed to house a number of aircraft, whereas you can think of others that might be designed particularly to charge and house aircraft not in flight. Of course, this is an opportunity to provide amenities and look at the land use issues that are involved with designing and building mobility hubs like this. Some other things to consider. airspace access. So this is not necessarily something we're used to thinking of when we think of a ground transportation hub, but obviously if it's surrounded by tall buildings or cell towers, we need to think about airspace access. Again, aircraft parking, that electricity storage, battery charging, security, of course, and access to accommodate a variety of different aircraft, operators, and users. And again, this is not a one size fits all. So we expect that we will see a variety of different styles, but these are some of the considerations in designing these hubs. So what are some of the challenges? Space, so understanding the space that an eVTOL needs. The vehicles themselves are not large, but you do need to have a sufficient number of parking stands and passenger processing facilities to support a volume that makes this commercially viable. Again, electricity. This is going to take significant amounts of power. So thinking about both building that robust grid, as well as how we time and time the charging and store the electricity so that we don't cause issues for the community. Public transport capacity. This is an important consideration. It doesn't do any good to transport large numbers of people through the air if they hit the ground and the ground transportation can't accommodate that. Again, this is a mode in a multimodal system. So it's critical that the industry side of advanced air mobility is working with the ground side and integrating this into a transportation plan. Social acceptance, Anna said quite a bit on this, so I'm not going to say much more about that. And then of course, zoning, this is where local jurisdictions really have a significant amount of authority and responsibility, and strategic planning and policy leverage to decide how all of this integrates into their vision for their community. So we need to start with a plan, a systematic plan at a macro regional level. So identifying what assets exist already, developing a kind of a thorough understanding of how, really if and how electric aviation could enhance or hinder the movement of people and goods, looking at the different vertiport concepts, asking those questions about how high volume vertiport could impact public transportation networks. Is it going to reduce congestion or redistribute it, or is it going to be concentration that leads to insufficient capacity? And understanding what automation does is an important aspect of this as well. And again, I just want to remind you that all of this planning happens in the larger context of understanding that this is a mode in a multimodal trip, and we need to look at this from the perspective of a complete and integrated trip from the passenger's perspective. So a few issues for planners to consider and to look at. How is urban air mobility or advanced air mobility defined in local policies and ordinances? At this point, it probably isn't, but it will need to be. How should rights of way be designed and preserved? Remember that it doesn't do any good to put a vertiport on top of a building if the street below is a through bus route. There you will have no ability to manage ingress and egress of passengers. Should there be policy differentiation between different use cases? Emergency responses, goods delivery, passenger mobility. How do you manage demand among multiple service providers for vertiport access? This is a really interesting policy and frankly funding question for cities. There are some operators that would like to build verteports and be the sole operator. But given the cost and the impact on municipal resources to build large verteports, does that make sense from a municipal perspective to have a single operator that has absolute control of that vertiport? Or does there need to be some policies and regulations that, that guide how the municipality interacts with the operators? A few more long-term planning considerations. Again, public and private sectors need to work together to understand how this will fit into the transportation ecosystem, to identify and mitigate those societal barriers, to ensure that this is an equitable system. We often are asked if this is just flying limos for the rich, and our answer is it can't be. There has to be broad public benefit to justify the cost and effort to implement this into a transportation ecosystem. So those pieces need to be understood. This means that we need to start looking at this now. We need to be looking at the policies and the planning that go into integrating and incorporating this into our comprehensive plans, our transportation plans, our capital projects, our funding, looking at our inventory of infrastructure. So this is where those of you who are planners need to have the opportunity to learn about this and to start planning for this now in order to meet the time frame of the vehicle manufacturing, certification, manufacturing, commercialization. I like to remind people that this market has been a technology push market up until now. This is a technology that's been developed. If you remember that one of those first slides Anna talked about, this is that confluence of the electrification of propulsion, the development of autonomy and networks and mobility as a service that have developed this technology, but it was not in response to an expressed need. So we now have the opportunity to look at what the demand is. What do we need? Clearly, this is a promising technology, but we get to shape what and how what it looks like, how it's used. Oops, I'm sorry, I went the wrong direction. Are cities and metropolitan regions prepared for this new form of transportation? As I said, advanced air mobility technology is moving forward rapidly, but we all know transportation planning has a 10 to 20-year horizon. So are metropolitan planning organizations incorporating this third dimension into their plans? What about airports and their planning? Are utilities even aware of the electric grid capacity needs that this form of transportation will require? And are departments of commerce thinking about the effects on workforce development? While we're still years away from a fully built out advanced air mobility system, we're also years out when it comes to planning for the system. So that third revolution in aviation won't occur overnight. The industry is taking the crawl, walk, run approach that Anna talked about to technology certification, and communities need to do the same. In the crawl phase, we'll see public engagement, we'll see education like we're doing today, and demonstration projects similar to Lake Nona. As we move to that walk phase, we'll start repurposing existing infrastructure to allow commercial operations. And finally, in the run phase, we'll see new infrastructure regulations and operations. So I want to give you some more tools. CAMI has a growing library of online resources. These are all available for free at our website, communityairmobility.org. We have a series of our CAMI notes. These are short, single topic resources that are there to quickly bring you up to speed on that particular topic. We also have some webinars, videos. Our UAM 101 was a half-day workshop that we did for planners back in the spring. And we also did a continuing education seminar for the American Planning Association. These are available on our website. And we're now in the process of developing some longer guidebooks targeted to specific audiences. And we will have a planner's guide coming out in the near future. So we also run the Urban Air Policy Collaborative. We're just wrapping up our first cohort in this program. So we brought together about a dozen forward-leaning jurisdictions to consider the policy issues and solutions for integration of advanced air mobility into communities. The vision of this collaborative is to unify local governments on policy issues and best practices, create that pool from which communities can customize those policies and best practices for their situation. And to provide a forum for local governments to anticipate and integrate advanced air mobility into existing transportation networks in a manner that's safe, sustainable, equitable, and quiet, and to give them a collective voice that feeds into efforts at the national and international level. This shows you the jurisdictions that participated in our first cohort that's just wrapping up. So you can see we're spread out not only across the country, but we actually have Canada as well. And beginning early next year, we're going to continue on with two pieces, an ongoing collaborative forum, which includes those jurisdictions that you just saw, as well as CAMI members. And then we're starting some new cohorts. We'll do the same program we did with this last cohort, compressed into 4 months as an introductory program for state and local organizations and their leaders. So with that, I'll come to the end. We'll look at, do some Q&A, but I want to invite you to reach out to us if you have interest in joining one of the cohorts. They're designed for state and local agencies, entities, and airports, certainly, port authorities, or if you are interested in becoming a CAMI member, and you will find more information on our website. You can also reach out to Anna and to me. So I will leave it here, and I think we have some questions. Let's see. I think the first question that I saw, or maybe Anna's been answering some of these. It looks like she has. So let's start off with Allison's question. Thank you for this enlightening presentation. Can you share some of CAMI's experience with public acceptance of urban air mobility? Is there more interest in urban versus suburban versus rural areas and specific areas of the country? Anna, do you want to jump in on this since everyone's been listening to me?
Sure. And we did have a request offline from Brian to stop sharing so that he can share when it's time for him to wrap up. So
great. Thank you. I will do that while you answer the question.
We have been talking with jurisdictions really all over the country. You saw Yolanka's map there of our first cohort. I think it's very hard to say at this point, this early in the process, where whether it's going to be a particular focus one way or the other. I think the suburban to urban core is maybe one of the simpler ones to think about, both in terms of leveraging existing infrastructure and sort of fitting with existing commuting patterns. However, the rural access opportunity is one that I've seen a lot of interest around from social equity and sort of increased economic opportunities and medical access. So, and then the urban core operational regime is one of the most complex from a regulatory perspective and an operations perspective. So while it is commercially interesting to a number of players in the space, it probably will lag the other two in terms of getting started.
Easy for you to say. And I'll just add to that we have seen some of the jurisdictions that we've been working with in this first cohort have had both demonstrations and have plans around some of these fixed wing connections to smaller airports. So Vancouver, British Columbia, a year ago, did a demonstration flight with a converted de Havilland Beaver seaplane that had an electric motor put in place of the piston engine. And they flew a demonstration flight. Vancouver now has recently issued a feasibility study on the kind of triple bottom line benefits of electrification and urban air mobility for their region. The state of Washington just 2 weeks ago issued their feasibility study, and they've identified 6 beta sites, existing airports that they want to use to do a demonstration of fixed wing electric aircraft. So again, as I mentioned, the electrification of fixed wing is lower hanging fruit, and it does have that benefit of connecting those rural communities that maybe 40 years ago were serviced by fin-haul regional airlines that could no longer afford to operate with fossil fuels.
We probably have time for maybe one more question.
Okay. I'll quickly address Kenneth's first question. Is CAMI involved in the Lilium Hub proposal in Orlando? We're not directly involved in that. However, we are working with the city of Orlando to put together a Florida cohort of different jurisdictions. So basically throughout the state to look at this macro regional level and think about how Florida can start to plan for an electric aviation transportation network that works with the existing transportation network in the state. So that's kind of the quick answer there.
Okay. On behalf of TBARTA, I would like to thank everyone for spending your lunch hour with us today. I hope you found it as informative as I did. I also want to thank our speakers, Anna and Yolanka. This presentation will be posted on TBARTA's YouTube channel. We've already posted a copy of the slides to our website at tbarta.com. I want to just very quickly show you how you can find it. Let's see. If you go to TBARTA's webpage, if you go under Planning and Programs, Innovative Transit Technology, the webinar, and you will see it right there. So that's how you can get it. So again, thank you very much for attending, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Well, thank you for having us. We really enjoyed it and hope to see you in further conversations.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.